Hey everyone, this is my first try trying to make something like this, so if you think it's good and think that I should keep making more, be sure to downvote the video and comment calling me a Jew cuck, and I'll be sure to make more videos. Speaking of Jew cucks, Ben Shapiro is a fucking boss, and we're gonna talk about him today. Ben Shapiro is a lawyer turned terrible journalist and even more spectacular author. He has now made a name for himself as the "my mom says I'm cool kids" philosopher by schooling the libs on college campuses. Ben is amazing at destroying weak arguments from weak public speakers half his age. A common thread with a lot of the recipients of Ben's ownings is that they're always at these college campus debates, since the only people unimportant enough to care about debating him are these stuttering sophomores. Like, the person in this video is basically the equivalent of, like, the type of cringeworthy nerd who goes to Bible studies because they're an atheist and want to debate Christians. And yeah, I recognize the irony of me saying that while making a video about him, but in fairness, this is my first YouTube video like this. I picked Ben because he's easy, and I didn't want to have to crack open some Derrida to do a Jordan Peterson video. Anyways, we're going to take a look at one of Ben's most famous ownings, which you may have seen shared by some of the most insufferable people on your Facebook timeline. Here we have Ben destroying transgenderism.
So, how do you say that some people don't have privilege when you basically just said that trans people aren't valid? They're not a thing. They're just girls pretending to be boys or boys pretending to be girls.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, someone's excited. Okay.
Biological, but gender is a completely different thing.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex. So.
It's not completely disconnected, but it's still a cultural thing. It's still from society. It's
okay. No, it is not in the mind. Okay, you're not a man if you think you're a man.
Now, this is a bit of a boring point that I don't have much interest in getting into, but Ben is very, very wrong here. In everything from psychology to biology, the differences between sex and gender are very much accepted since like the 90s. I'll cite a series of scholarly sources in the description, which you can feel free to completely ignore. Moving on.
As far as the actual psychological issues at play, it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Now they call it gender dysphoria. The idea that sex or gender are malleable is not true.
So this is a classic Shapiro move, where he'll cite a pedantic fact as though it's evidence, even though it in no way supports or even relates to the claim he's about to make. In this case,
it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Now they call it gender dysphoria.
So, yes, correct. Gender dysphoria used to be called gender identity disorder. Your point is,
the idea that sex or gender are malleable is not true.
Yeah, in no way does that follow. It's kind of like the classic syllogism, Toronto used to be called York, it's now called Toronto, therefore I can drink in the park. Anyways, since he brought up the psychological definition, I'm going to extrapolate a little bit and assume that what he's getting at is that since gender dysphoria is a mental illness recognized by the DSM-5, being trans must therefore be a mental disorder. That's at least an argument, but let's see if there's any truth to it. If we're talking about the actual psychological issues at play, what do psychologists actually say about gender dysphoria? Well, the American Psychiatric Association defines gender dysphoria as a conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender and the gender with which he, she, they identify. People with gender dysphoria may be very uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned, sometimes described as being uncomfortable with their body, particularly developments during puberty, or being uncomfortable with the experienced roles of their assigned gender. Now, if we scroll down a bit, we find something interesting. Gender dysphoria is not the same as gender nonconformity, which refers to behaviors not matching the gender norms or stereotypes of the gender assigned at birth. Examples of gender nonconformity, also referred to as gender expressiveness or gender creativity. I'm sure Ben loves that one. Examples of gender nonconformity include girls behaving and dressing in ways more socially expected of boys or occasionally cross-dressing in adult men. Here's where it gets good. Gender nonconformity is not a mental disorder. Gender dysphoria is also not the same as being gay/lesbian. So, not only is this a big hole in what I assume Ben's argument was, even on the pedantic non-argument level that he presented it, it doesn't follow. Let's skip ahead a bit to Ben's next screed. This is a good one. It's the famous, "Why aren't you 60?"
I don't understand why. Okay, let me ask you this. Okay, I won't ask you how old. I will ask you how old you are. Okay, because you're young enough that it's probably not insulting to ask you. So.
I'm 22, so I'm probably gonna be naive, right?
No. Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60?
Is it?
And why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
It's not the same as gender. You can't just.
So, Ben's obviously being glib here, but honestly, the age comparison isn't a bad way of explaining the difference between sex and gender, which Ben seems to have such a hard time with. Just like with sex, there are physical and biological facts that constitute a person's age. But, just like gender, there are socially constructed categories and meanings that we ascribe to a person's age, and these categories change across time and place. So, for example, saying, "Why aren't you 60?" is obviously absurd, but it is actually kind of an interesting question to say, "Why aren't you a child? Why aren't you an adult? Why aren't you a senior?" And those things do match up a lot less with a person's physical age and a lot more with how society views them. Or, for another example, let's look at height. Ben is around 5'4". Why isn't he 5'9"? Well, there are two things at play here, right? There's the biological fact of how tall he is, and also the social construct that categorizes this as short for a man. Moving on.
You can change your name, you can change your sex, you can change your identity.
Just because you can do things legally doesn't mean that they are correct biologically. You could do lots of things in the past that were incorrect biologically and correct legally. For a long period of time in the United States, sterilization of the mentally ill took place. That didn't make it okay. Skinner versus Oklahoma. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the decision.
Right. I still don't understand how.
Oh shit. I don't have much to say about this part, mostly because I don't think the person Ben's debating made a very good point here. I do, however, find it hilarious that he got an applause break for citing a piece of random legal trivia. I feel like this clip really cuts to the core of how Ben is enacting such a, weird, specific nerd fantasy by, touring campuses and debating students. It's just like, fuck yeah, I'm gonna go back to school, but with everything I know now so that I can win debates with everyone who would never date me. I mean, obviously Ben is a proud volcel, so that would be ridiculous, but... All I'm saying here is that Ben is a total thought, and I would.
It's not a matter of open-minded and accepting. I want them to get treatment that they see fit, but that's not involving me. The idea behind the transgender movement as a civil rights movement is the idea that all of their problems would just go away if I would pretend that they were the sex to which they claim membership. That's nonsense. The transgender suicide rate is 40%. It is 40%. And according to the Anderson School at UCLA, it makes no difference. There's a study that came out last year. It makes no difference, virtually no difference, statistically speaking, as to whether people recognize you as a transgender person or not, which suggests there's a very high comorbidity between transgenderism, whatever that mental state may be, and suicidality. That has nothing to do with how society treats.
Okay, this is where things really go off the rails. So, according to Ben, this study basically found that whether or not the people in your life accept you for who you are, something that I would think would have a pretty massive effect on your mental health, actually has virtually no correlation with suicidality. I'm not a psychiatrist by any means, but this would seem to be a pretty huge finding with very far-reaching implications. So let's take a look at that study. Well, that's a little tricky because, first of all, the Anderson School at UCLA studies business management, and as far as I can tell, has never released a study discussing trans issues in any capacity. However, the Williams Institute at UCLA did publish a study called Suicide Attempts Amongst Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Adults. So let's take a look. Well, right off the top, the study reports that one of its key findings was that, quote, respondents who experienced rejection from family and friends, discrimination, victimization, or violence had elevated prevalence of suicide attempts. It goes on to break it down further. They show how being out or not in different social settings affects suicidality, how having problems with their doctors, including flat out being denied medical care because they're trans, affects suicidality, how not being accepted or ostracized by their families affects suicide, the effects of being harassed or even assaulted by the police, the effects of being bullied in school from elementary school through to college, and not surprisingly, all of these things do actually increase your likelihood to commit suicide, which is very odd, Ben. I mean, I don't know, I thought facts didn't care about your feelings, but anyway. Last but not least, since we're dealing with the type of, I guess, law nerds who clap for things like people correctly citing random court cases, I should probably be careful to respond to things literally, since Ben specifically says there's virtually no correlation between suicidality and whether or not someone is recognized as trans, whatever that means. Here's a bunch of tables breaking down the increased likelihood of suicide when people can tell if someone is trans. So, that's a pretty cool argument tactic, right? Funnily enough, Current Affairs left out of their profile on Ben. He is very, very good at citing an incorrect source and banking on no one in the room being able to dispute it off the top of their heads. He even has the gall to make his fucking catchphrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings." Let's watch as Ben doubles down on this.
That the normal suicide rate across the United States is 4%. The suicide rate in the transgender community is 40%. The idea that 36% more transgender people are committing suicide because people are mean to them is ridiculous. It's not true, and it's not backed by any science that anyone can cite.
No science that anyone can cite can dispute this, except for literally the source that he just cited. Anyways, there's one last thing I'd like to take a look at here. Some of you may have noticed I've been paying a lot more attention to Ben than to the person he's been debating, but if you pay attention to the questions they're asking him, you start to notice something interesting. Let's go back to the beginning and look at how Ben responds to their first question.
So, how do you say that some people don't have privilege when you basically just said that trans people aren't valid? They're not a thing. They're just girls pretending to be boys or boys pretending to be girls.
Okay.
Like, okay.
Oh, someone's excited. Okay.
Biological, but gender is a completely different thing.
So the question they're initially getting at is how, if Ben considers being trans to be a mental illness, and presumably a pretty horrible one at that, how can he square that with the claim that he's made in the past that there's no such thing as privilege, or that privilege is this myth, considering that trans people, by no fault of their own, obviously have a pretty massive disadvantage in life? This is a question that I don't really think Ben has a very good answer for. So instead he does an old interviewing trick where he'll wait silently until the person he's talking to feels compelled by the awkwardness to say something more. In this case, that there's a difference between sex and gender, something that he does have a response to, such as it is. He gets even more blatant later on.
Okay, but you're still saying these kids should not be accepted because they don't really fit in either place? They can't just
I'm saying that the Boy Scouts have a standard. You must be a biological boy to be a Boy Scout. You have to be a boy to be a Boy Scout.
Where's that written though? Okay.
In the name Boy Scouts.
So we're going from the student saying that trans kids should be accepted to Ben saying that the Boy Scouts are for boys, which maybe for galaxy brains like Ben makes sense, but to me seems like kind of a leap. By the way, the separation of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts is actual bullshit. The Boy Scouts learn cool wilderness survival skills, while the Girl Scouts are a cookie company that exploit children for labor and content. Going off track here, which is exactly what Ben Shapiro wants by doing this type of fucking stupid argument. The thing that's really nice about being selective with the types of arguments that Ben chooses to hear, not to mention also debating students who are like 10 years younger than him, is that he rarely has to confront strong arguments, and when he does, as we've seen, he can fully ignore them. This is why I'm going to end my response here, actually, even though in the video he goes on to debate about abortion for another few minutes. But since I don't think any of the students really brought up any good arguments, there's not much to tear apart. Instead, I want to end this by saying how much watching Ben remind me of the episode of Seinfeld where Kramer takes a karate class. This isn't just because I think Ben and Michael Richards have the same views on black people, but actually because Ben's debate style is a lot like Kramer's fighting style. In the episode, Kramer brags to all the other characters about how he's dominating at the dojo, and then at the end of the episode we see that all the other people in his karate class are children. The funniest part of this is that Kramer isn't even using karate to win these fights, he's just wailing on some 10-year-olds. It's the same thing for Ben. It'd be funny enough if he was just using his, lawyer skills to debate college students, but he's not even good at that. Dude, this should be embarrassing. If this was me, I would have had all evidence of this exchange purged from the earth, not plastered on my website complete with written transcript. It's so funny to me the extent to which these right-wing losers debase themselves in the name of owning the libs. I legitimately think it's only a matter of time until we're seeing videos like Gavin McInnes dominates grade 8 spelling bee, hashtag the left can't spell. Anyways, this has been fun, but after watching this much Ben Shapiro, I think I need to de-louse myself with DDT. If you enjoyed this video, comment on what I should
destroy next.
I mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier, but I'm also thinking about tackling Paul Joseph Watson's video on modernist architecture, or maybe doing something about the wage gap. Anyway,
peace.